Hello and welcome to the DweltOggy show, which, for the second week in a row, has failed to deliver the promised video. Yes, yet again I've got to apologise for the lack of a Tomb Raider video. It's still coming, but this week is Blunt Lemon's Star Wars week. And with the imminent release of Rogue One, I thought it more prudent to do a video on a Star Wars gaming series. Also, I want views, and I'm willing to whore this show out to Google search trends anytime. So this week we're looking at the Force Unleashed games. I have a soft spot for these games, and with their wacky, over-the-top, Force-themed antics, there's nothing quite like destroying thousands of stormtroopers. Before the expanded universe was invalidated by Disney, this was the story that fitted between episodes 3 and 4, the same space Rogue One now aims to fill. So I thought it was fitting that this was the series that we should take a look at, to honour the release of Rogue One. So without further ado, let's talk Star Wars The Force Unleashed. So let's talk about the Force. Remember in Empire Strikes Back when Yoda lifts the X-Wing out of the water? The music swells, minds are blown, the Force is proven a powerful ally to those with belief. Well, Force Unleashed saw this, and they thought they could do better. Not only are we ripping TIE fighters out of the air and screwing them up like pieces of paper, but whole Star Destroyers too. The Apprentice seems to, with no effort, grab ships out of the air and pull them into columns, push over giant robots, subdue giant monsters, and electrocute whole sarlaccs. The power of the other Jedi seem to pale in significance compared to the powers of the Apprentice. He makes the Emperor look like a little bitch.
You were destined to destroy me.
The Force has never been this powerful. Games offer such a delightfully over-the-top representation of it. If the Force was as it was in the movies, it would never have been this riotous over-the-top fun that it is in the game. When Luke asks,
"Is the dark side stronger?"
Yoda should have just said, "More powerful it is. Struggle to lift an X-Wing I do. With the dark side, whole Star Destroyers can be pulled out of the sky." The incredible world-breaking power of the Force aside, using the Force in the game feels great. Picking up a stormtrooper and dangling them off a cliff, or smashing them through glass is one of life's simple pleasures. The Apprentice has lots of Force powers at his disposal as well. The Force push is the most basic and can be hilariously overpowered in both games, sending stormtroopers toppling like bowling pins. Lightning can fry scores of enemies at a time. Zapping enemies and watching them twitch fills me with a sense of fulfillment I can't explain without looking like a total psychopath. Force grip can be used to lift enemies for the aforementioned stormtrooper torture. Lightsabers can be thrown at enemies. Force repulse is one of my favourites, allowing the Apprentice to push and most likely kill dozens of enemies at the same time. It's just so damn powerful. Lightning shield is a bit useless, but has its very limited usefulness. But my favourite is by far the Jedi mind trick, introduced in Force Unleashed 2. In A New Hope, it seems that the Jedi mind trick is used to slightly fool someone into making a decision, slightly push them towards a certain outcome, but here it's just straight up mind control. I ordered a man to kill himself.
You can leave now.
I'm leaving.
Tricked another into believing his allies are enemies.
You are a rebel spy.
One guy just told him he worked for me now, and then he killed all his friends. It's glorious. While the Force might be completely at odds with what is shown in the movies and cutscenes and TV shows, Heck, it's even more powerful in the hands of the apprentice and the others who use it in the game. The game emphasizes having fun with it, over keeping accuracy to the movies and source material. It's fun to do the ridiculous things the game allows you to do, and I'd take that over a more accurate portrayal of the Force anytime. The lightsaber, on the other hand, is much less satisfying in The Force Unleashed. You can easily dispatch enemies with it, and it's even required at times, but swinging it never feels like a lightsaber should. Following the game's ridiculous use of the Force, hitting an enemy with a lightsaber should destroy them, but it doesn't. It feels more like you're hitting them with a stick or a baseball bat or something like that. It just never quite feels right. By the time The Force Unleashed 2 rolls around, the developers had clearly thought about this. Now the lightsaber removes heads and arms in a blazing whirl of fury. They even give you a second one. Is it just me, or does two reverse lightsabers just look a little weird? While this goes some way to addressing the problem, it still doesn't feel quite right when an enemy can take multiple hits and be fine. When a QTE animation is going, or a cutscene playing, a lightsaber can go through people and chop straight through an ATST with no problems, and this could make the combat in the game feel even more weak. The force combos and lightsaber combos go some way into making the combat feel pretty good, but the lightsaber never feels like a lightsaber. It's not to say the combat is bad, it's not, it's perfectly serviceable, but in a game that relishes in its over-the-top force combos or moves, the lightsaber never quite fits in. Before Rogue One set out to fill the gaps between Episode 3 and 4, The Force Unleashed tried its hand at bridging the gap. Also before the time of the Clone Wars, it was the first to attempt to give Vader an apprentice, so in many ways a trailblazer for what the current Star Wars canon is trying. Overall, I think the story presented by the games is alright. Let me elaborate. The first game has a pretty decent story. The story of how the rebellion was formed and how Vader had a hand in it is generally quite interesting. Also, participating in the process of hunting down members of the Jedi Order and seeing where these Jedi got to and what they did after the Order fell is a very cool part of the Star Wars lore to explore. It has its moments of confusion, however. If this was the Emperor's plan, did he let Vader train this boy for like 20 years just to carry out this plan? The only way to find the Emperor's enemies was to let them form an army first? And none of the Emperor's dissenters asked any questions about the mysterious, incredibly powerful Force user. But in the end, the story makes a likeable cast of characters in the main group and gives a compelling story of redemption for the apprentice, despite the weird leaps of logic the plot takes. The ending allowed the player to choose which side of the Force they wanted to ally with. One is the light side and is the canon ending. On the other hand, the dark side ending creates a cool alternative universe ending in which the apprentice replaces Darth Vader as the Emperor's servant.
You had such promise. You could have been my successor, my equal. But now... But I may still have some small use for you. I still have enemies to find and destroy. You will do my bidding until I find a new apprentice. And then, like Vader, you will be cast aside. Finish him.
Force Unleashed 2, on the other hand, is a very confusing mess. So the game follows a light side ending in which the apprentice sacrifices himself for his rebel friends, allowing them to escape. Turns out that Vader, in a very strange move, decided to clone him to create another dark side version to try and ruin his legacy. Because that won't turn out badly. But maybe it's not a clone, it's left rather ambiguous. According to Jedi General Kota, it is impossible to clone a Jedi. The light side ending has the cloned apprentice and the rebellion capture Darth Vader, while the dark side ending sees the cloned apprentice die to a super dark side version of himself. Neither ending makes sense for the canon, really. Assuming the light side is canon, it leaves it open for a sequel, but it is a really weird cliffhanger that doesn't make much sense when fit into the Star Wars lore. If the dark side ending is canon, then most of the events of the game don't really make sense. Why not just send this better clone after the Rogue One? Roll credits. Instead of Boba Fett, Why does Vader care to lure the Rogue clone back to Kamino if he has a better one? Why try to get the player control clone to work for him? Force Unleashed 2 is just a mess that is more on the side of fanfiction than legitimate Star Wars story. The Force Unleashed attempted to fit in with the established canon and create a story that was interesting and filled in gaps. By the time Force Unleashed 2 came around, I feel the writers didn't know how to continue the story with the definitive end that the first game established, so they went full crazy with it and it really didn't work at all in the end. Whether the story was good or not, both games go some way towards expanding the Star Wars universe. To planets either only mentioned or to new locales that have not been seen before, such as Raxus Prime. Locales like Cato, New Moitu and Felucia flesh out a place that are only mentioned or seen very briefly in the movies. Even going to places like Kamino and the Death Star expanding on what we already know about them. Showing Kamino and its role in the Empire after the Clone Wars is rather cool, and fighting in the Death Star's firing tube and seeing the mechanisms for firing is also a cool way to expand that area. Another highlight is seeing Imperial Kashyyyk. Seeing how the Empire has enslaved the Wookiees and the damage they are doing to the planet lend an extra feeling of evil to the Empire. The mission where the apprentice goes to a TIE fighter factory again fleshes out a process that we haven't really thought about or seen in the movies or the lore. Beyond this, extra depth and tactics are given to the Empire, different troop varieties are seen, and vehicles not seen in the movies are shown quite often as well. This expansion of what we know about the Empire is really cool and adds to the Star Wars lore. Force Unleashed 2 also has data entries that again lend further expansion to their tactics, vehicles and troop. The games also explore Jedi characters that haven't been explored too much in other lore sources as well, such as Shaq Ti. Seeing other Jedi in hiding really expands the universe and lends an extra dimension to stories of the Jedi Order, after Order 66 is executed. Participating in the hunt for the Jedi in this time period is a cool piece of world building. The story of forming the rebellion is also a cool way of expanding that part of the story. While ultimately all this does not matter, as the Disney acquisition of Star Wars rendered all of this non-canon, it's still cool to see different worlds and parts of the Empire, in a way that we've not seen in the movies or other parts of the lore before. Being a character action game at its core, the game has a lot of boss fights against various Jedi and other creatures. The games offer different gimmicks for each boss fight, and they're usually quite engaging. The fights with the Jedi, however, rarely do look like duels from the movies. Often the fights also lean into the over-the-top nature of the Force. The apprentice often finishes his fights with an over-the-top display of the Force, like electrocuting an entire Sarlacc pit. However, there are boss fights that annoy me in the games, in the first game at any rate, and those are the ones against Darth Vader himself. These should be the shining example of boss fights in the game. Instead, he goes down in ways far easier than the other bosses in the game. It also kind of removes the threat of Darth Vader in future movies and games, seeing him taken down in such bitchy ways. Vader never quite feels as dynamic as the other bosses either, and spends a lot of his time throwing tubes or boxes at the player. This kind of makes him some of the easier boss fights in the game. The Emperor also has a strangely anticlimactic boss fight. By the time Force Unleashed 2 rolls around, the boss fights take a turn for the strangely long. Usually they have way more stages than their counterparts in the first game. There's also way less of them, but that's a side effect of the game being like half the length. However, they try to compensate by having them be much longer than the fights of the first game, but it really doesn't help with the runtime of the game. All three of the main boss fights in the Force Unleashed 2 are long and tedious and require repeating a certain process to win. The Gorg fight, God of War over the top by the way, is the first defender, requiring the player to repeatedly attach his hands to these cuffs to restrain him. The final Vader boss fight has so many stages, I got bored by the third time he released clones, and that was like only halfway through. While the boss fights in general aren't the highlights of the games, that honour goes to the overtop force powers, the second game has demonstrably worse boss fights. On a side note, it's not really a boss fight, but kinda is. I wanted to talk about bringing down the Star Destroyer in the first game. It must have glitched or something in it, and it refused to tell me that it was in the right position. So I spent ages carefully shifting it into the position the game was telling me, just to find out the game was wrong and I had to go with my own intuition and move it up anyway. Fuck that part of the game. boss fights and mini-bosses in the game end in quick-time events. I hate quick-time events for the most part. The Tomb Raider reboot in 2013, I quit because of an excessive amount of them. The Force Unleashed takes QTEs to a whole other level. There's so many mini-boss enemies that you can be doing them again and again in a single encounter. And when it comes to the mini-bosses, it's the same animation, again and again and again. I think there's at max 2 per mini-boss, and when there's so many mini-bosses the same animation will play dozens of times, and it's incredibly tiresome. Is there only one way to kill these damn shield robots? Kill mini-bosses without the QT, but often the quicker, easier way is to do it with one, as it also gives a reprieve from harder combat scenarios. I thought by the second they might have learned from the first. They didn't. It might even be worse. The boss fight enders don't anger me as much. They often look really cool and aren't too infuriating, but still the fights could have been ended in a much more inventive, cool and skillful way. By the way, the Emperor's QT, when you defeat him at the end of The Force Unleashed, is a strangely short one, when I feel like it should have been the longest and most epic of them all. He is the motherfucking Emperor. Before we end here, I want to mention the music of the games, as it did not really fit into the other sections at all. The music of this game fits well with the established Star Wars music, which is also liberally used throughout the games. The Force Unleashed fanfare still gives me chills. In the end, I like the Force Unleashed games rather a lot. Neither are masterpieces, especially the second game. Both emphasise the fun force powers and combat over movie and lore accurate force powers. It's incredibly fun to toss stormtroopers around and bowl them over with the force. In the time before Rogue One and Clone Wars, this really was a nice look into a period that's not often explored in the lore. It offered fans a chance to experience Star Wars through a different lens and discover more about the factions and locales. But none of it matters anyway. Its canon was always a little dubious, but it's definitely not canon now given the Disney Star Wars acquisition. And that brings us to the end of our journey into that galaxy far, far away. Again, I need to apologise for the lack of a Tomb Raider video for the second week in a row. It's still coming, but I thought this week would be way better served being a Star Wars video given Blunt Lemon's Star Wars week. And because, ultimately, I'm desperate to capitalise on trending search terms. Now here, have a compilation of Stormtrooper torture for our end card.